Hello, I'm David Pendergrass. I specialize in biblical studies and healthy relationships. This is part 2, my response to why I left Christianity. And this part, he's going to talk about his view that the Bible is just so problematic. Here we go.
And I was like in full-on research mode. It was my main interest at the time, was researching all this stuff. And so eventually I realized this thing. It's that the Bible is ambiguous. And a skilled teacher can make the Bible say anything they want. You can justify just about anything as long as you can do enough like word gymnastics and mental backflips to sort of turn this thing that could be taken literally, like slavery. I mean, the Bible openly condones slavery. It's not an accident that, in the United States, slavery was a real thing and a real problem. And there was a lot of Christians who owned slaves. It's not an accident. The Bible, you can easily justify slavery with the Bible. And I started to realize that really anybody could say anything they wanted by using the Bible. You've got these theories of hell. You can pick any topic, right? You want to go to war, you don't want to go to war. I mean, you can cherry pick verses. You can take things that are meant to be literal and make them metaphorical. You can take things that are meant to be metaphorical and completely distort them into these new crazy theories. I find it very confusing when the Bible will say something quite plainly, and then Christians will be like, oh, no, that's not what it means. It actually means this. And then they take it as this metaphor. And I started to question them, like, well, if you can just take anything at any time in the Bible and make it a metaphor for some other thing, I mean, how do you really... But at the same time, taking other things as literal. So the convenient things can be literal, but the inconvenient things like slavery can be taken, in this metaphor.
Yeah, so I hear you're saying. Yeah, well, so a few things. One is when a person says the Bible, I mean, like, carrying scholarship, I mean, we can say the word the Bible, but you just said a library. You say the Bible, the library is ambiguous. I mean, that would sound kind of stupid. I went to the local library and say, the library is ambiguous. I mean, that'd be I mean, it's silly. I would say, which book of the library is ambiguous, and what are you talking about? And so then we're talking about, which I've talked about to my nosebleeds on all my stuff material so far, which is you have just skipped over the number one basic Bible reading 101 class you take in college, which is genre studies. And that's why this is not a free-for-all. And you've done this the whole video, which Christians, and I appreciate that, especially if that's all you know. But my response is, I don't care what other Christians say. I care what scholars say. I care what people who can read 10 to 30 languages in the original language, in the original context. They've read about every single piece of literature in the ancient world. That's all they do all the time, every second of their entire adult lives. And they say, here's what these words mean, and I trust lexicographers who give us what the languages mean. You have to trust that, unless you have to go do 30 lifetimes of study yourself. You have to trust what these lexicons say the language means. You have to trust what the historian, and you all get together and they debate each other all the time, and they produce massive tomes, big works. You trust them. And then, of course, people like myself, you go to school for 12 years after high school, so you can do the same kind of thing. You learn these skill sets. It doesn't matter if Susie Q and Timmy at the pew next to me doesn't know what they're talking about. It doesn't matter if the local pastor can rip it out of context and say it's a metaphor. No, it's literal. I don't care. I care, but I don't care, because they're not my chief source of authority. The text is the chief source of authority, and to know how to read a text of any text, you figure out the genre. And the only way to do that is you have to learn how to do genre studies and read it well. And so I appreciate the conundrum you're in and the anxiety you feel because of it. And I'm trying to encourage you, listener or watcher, if you're not this person, is that if you find yourself in the same anxiety, you say, well, then stop listening to everybody who's in the pew. Listen to people or go get your own degrees. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't dismiss it all because Susie Q and Preacher Joe on the stage didn't say something you like, or it seems free willy-nilly. Well, then go get your own degrees. Or go read the real hard hitters. Go read the good biblical scholars and then debate them and say whether they find that persuasive. Then that's fair. I've read all the scholars and they're all wrong. I've got the truth. Okay, I mean, you can take that view. You can. But not because the person in the pew didn't say it. I mean,
it started to seem like a giant game. So along this time, I listened to a thing from Bruxy about the inerrancy of the Bible. And until this point, I had always assumed what I'd been taught. I was taught that the Bible was inerrant. That means there's no mistakes, no contradictions. It's perfect. It's the perfect word of God. Every word is God-breathed and inspired. Although it was written down by men, it is God's word. And that's why it's called the Word of God. So I was...
No, that's not what's called. Okay. Well, inerrant, that's right. Literally from the Latin means without error. And there are many different ways to define or the implications of what inerrant means. Inerrant is not a biblical term. It's Latin. The Bible's written chiefly in Hebrew and Greek with some Aramaic. And it's not written in Latin. So it's a term that people use about the Bible. I've done podcasts on this. I've talked a lot about inerrancy. But the most dominant way to understand inerrancy, based on the Chicago document of inerrancy back in 1970, blah, something, they describe very clearly and articulate what they understand to be the implications of inerrancy. It is not that it's perfect in everything he probably thought it meant. Now you could have that view, but that's not the dominant way that's not the dominant view that inerrantists have. And so, but anyway, we'll talk about that more.
Was just taught that it was inerrant. But one thing I started to realize with this whole literal versus metaphorical thing, as I saw people do all these mental backflips to create meaning out of things that seem to be clear, and they're trying to create another meaning. I started to realize that how can you really believe anything in the Bible is true? I think the inerrancy argument is fundamental to accepting that anything you read in the Bible is true. Because let's say, for example, that you...
That's absolutely false. So let's hear, I haven't heard this yet. So let's hear what is, if I'm not an inerrantist, therefore it follows from that, I can't believe anything in the Bible is true.
believe the Bible had errors, how could you really guarantee that anything that you've read, so let's say you read one little chapter or one verse, and then you use that to apply to your life, how do you know that that also isn't an error? So as soon as you admit that there might be errors, it really does, it's a rabbit hole to admitting there might be lots of errors. The whole thing might be unreliable. So...
Right. That's not a slippery... Yeah, it's okay. You just changed the subject a few times. If a person says there's an error there, and you ask the question, what if that next paragraph has errors? That's fair. That's a fair question. That's what we do in scholarship. All of them. This isn't... I mean, for you as epiphany, I guess that's cool, but that's what normal people do in scholarship of any kind of field all the time, especially when it comes to literature. And so then the question is, does that one have an error? Does that one have an error? And so by error, you have to ask, error of what? That is to say, what is the content of this paragraph from this piece of work attempting to declare as truth? That matters. That's the whole ball game. This whole ball game. That's why genre study matters so much. If I pick up in this library, why trust the library? If there's one book in the library, why trust the whole library? The whole library could be full of mistakes. Well, the whole library could be wrong. It would be silly to think because of one book I pulled off, it therefore follows that it is likely that every other book in the library is full of errors. That doesn't make any sense at all. It's one book of a whole plethora of books. You could ask the question, are there other errors in other books? Great. But then they go, okay, that's fine. But then the genre study is, what kind of error are you talking about? If I pull out this one book and I open up and I go, I use an analogy all the time. I looked at my wife and I felt butterflies in my stomach. Error, error, error. Next. I look at the sun and I glow inside. Error, error. And I flip through, because we all know it's stupid that butterflies don't live in people, and we know that humans can't glow, and it's full of error. I mean, why trust the library? Why trust the library? So any normal person and normal common sense, just normal stuff, right? We go and say, oh, baby, they pat me on the head. Oh, David, baby. You've picked up a book called poetry. Oh, no, I can read. Listen, you can do all the gymnastics you want. You can just metaphor literal. It's so ambiguous. This whole library is just stupid now. It's all free for all because you can do all your, and you went to school for 4 years. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, wouldn't that be silly? Wouldn't that be silly and unfair? Isn't it basic, like elementary, middle school, high school? You learn roses are red, violets are blue. And is that true? No, it's error. Some roses aren't red. Some roses aren't red. That's what the poem said, though. I mean, there's a truth that poetry is trying to convey that can be true or false. Is it true that a person felt tingly sensations physiologically in their innards when they saw a love of their life, like my wife? Yes, that's true. Well, then it's not false. That is true. That's the message I'm trying to convey. So what most inerrantists will say is that the Bible is true in all that it affirms. Now, I don't like that term inerrant for multiple reasons. It's very problematic. But that's one of the reasons why it is problematic, is because then Christians and scholars, we debate all the time upon what the text is trying to affirm. Now, we like to disagree on everything. That's what scholars do. I'm not at that level and write commentaries every day because I'm a full-time pastor. My point is, that's fair enough, but it does not follow from that what the text is trying to affirm is irrelevant. It is absolutely relevant. So just because one paragraph in one text of, say, the Gospels, what is an error? What is it? Now, there are, well, I won't give you examples. Maybe here in a little bit we'll see what he says. I'm just trying to make sure this is very clear. I'm belaboring this point because I hear this one a lot online in the real world when I talk to people. The Bible's full of errors, and they throw their hands up in despair and say, I can't trust any of it. That just does not follow.
It seems to me, and this is something that I've always been a little confused about, how people can admit there's errors in the Bible, yet still treat it as truth.
Oh, great. Easy. Genre. That's it. So I look at genre studies and try to decide what the genre is. And then within that genre, then I'm trying to decide what kind of truth it's trying to convey and what I care about. So for example, let's say the Gospels. The Gospels, virtually every New Testament specialist historian, whether they're Satan worshipers or Jews or Christians, is irrelevant. These are people whose learned trade from the top schools on the planet study ancient texts, whether it's Shakespeare, whether it's Cicero, it doesn't matter. A classicist studies ancient documents, and virtually all New Testament scholars at some level have been trained in that kind of subspecialty in most schools, not all. And that's like myself. And so you study the genre of a gospel, and virtually everyone agrees, ever since the watershed book of one of my professor mentors, Charles Talbert, 1977, responding against Rudolf Bultmann, and then later on Richard Burge came out with a book, What Are the Gospels? Most people agree, that virtually everyone does, that Gospels are an ancient form of biography. That matters for multiple reasons, and I say a lot of that in the book. What book, you ask? This book right here. I know it can be very difficult to know exactly how to understand what Jesus taught, and so I wrote this book to help you. Rediscover Jesus, I think, is a fantastic, accessible source to help you understand the teachings of Jesus within historical context. What did he mean when he said those things? What are the main things Jesus taught? Secondly, how do I apply it to today? This book will help you do both. It will help you understand what Jesus said to his first century Jewish audience, and how to bridge the gap between then and now. This is a fantastic book for small groups or individual studies. It's in paperback, Kindle version, and an audiobook recorded by yours truly. If you would like bulk orders of this for many people, let me know and I'll give you a special discount. Go right now to Amazon.com, get your copy today of Rediscover Jesus. So in that book, I talk some about the absolute point of genres. And so genre of the Gospels are a kind of ancient biography. That matters because, at minimum, it matters because that means an ancient person would have read Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John as a kind of history, not the same as basic history like we might go to history class today in high school, but it was a kind of history, which means they thought it really happened in the space-time continuum, that Jesus really existed, really said these kinds of things and did these kinds of things. Having said that, everyone knows in this field that ancient bios or lives, ancient biographies, everybody knows that when you study, for example, Plutarch's Lives, which is the best, most well-known analogy for the ancient gospel that we have for ancient biographies, that Plutarch routinely mix and match different facts and figures and expanded or truncated or moved chronological things around. They had freedom within that genre of ancient biography to do such things. Then you go read the Gospels and you go, oh my goodness, it's just like an ancient biography of Plutarch. Right. So, but what we don't follow from that, of course, is that if this one thing didn't happen the way it said, the whole thing is dismissed. That just doesn't follow. And so you have to look at each case by case by case by case and then decide, is this corroborated by outside sources or archaeological finds, or is it discorroborated? We know for a fact that wasn't there. We know that city wasn't there. That's what we're looking for. Historians are looking for that kind of discorroboration to know for sure that they're wrong. The other times you have times in the text where they counter each other, and you have to figure out either both can't be right. One is right, but we can't decide which one exactly as it happened. So, for example, we have some examples of that in the Gospels. For example, in Mark's Gospel, Mark 11, Jesus goes on his way into the temple. He curses the fig tree and curses it, and everyone agrees that's a metaphor or a parable, but it's a reverse cursing, reverse miracle. I call it, that's my word, reverse miracle. Where he cursed the fig tree, it's a metaphor of saying, I'm going to curse the temple. Because why? Because the fig tree bore no fruit. In Matthew's gospel, it's on the way out of the temple, not before it. And she would say, some people might say, well, he did it twice. And that's fine. The Gospels don't say he did it twice. The Gospels sure make an indication that it happened one time. But they can't both be true. He did it on the way to the temple or outside the temple. So one of these is false, one is true. Now what do we do? Well, the Gospels are all stupid. I mean, nobody in the world does that except for atheists and people who've deconstructed from the faith. So in the real world of real historians, nobody does that. If we did that kind of thing, we would have no historical record of anything ever, virtually, because they disagree with each other. Authors disagree with themselves in the exact same document. Josephus, the Jewish historian, did this often. In the book of Acts, the same author gives three different stories of how Luke had his Damascus Road experience. They're not radically different, but they're nuanced different. So it just doesn't follow that these distinctions therefore means everything else in the document is therefore not to be trusted. This supposed slippery slope argument, it's not persuasive to anybody in the field at all. If, like you're, like seeing the forest, not the trees, and you say, oh, no, this is a sacred, fallen from heaven document that can never have a disparity ever, sure, then you are stuck. And that's why almost maybe everybody I've ever met and read so far in my life, every one of them was fundamentalist. It's this constant, incessant, all or nothing, all or nothing, all or nothing. That's what Bart Ehrman did, right? It's all or nothing, all or nothing. If it wasn't exactly God from heaven breathed in, including the copying process, which really nailed Bart Ehrman, even the manuscripts, they were not copied perfectly. And if God inspired, he would have made sure that everything's perfect, never an error. You can do that. I don't do that. I don't see any reason to do that. If the Gospels had multiple examples of things, we don't know if that's historically corroborated or not. It does not follow from that the massive gist of the Gospels and the parables and the exorcisms and the healings and the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth and his death and his resurrection didn't occur. It doesn't follow. We have really good reasons to believe that the vast core, particularly the synoptic, but even though I would say, okay, the Gospels, all four of them, did occur as they said. But there are problems, absolutely, and scholars love to debate everything, and they can. It doesn't follow from that you can't trust it.
So I think that's why, for me, you have to look at the Bible as inerrant. If you're taking literal truths out of it, it has to be inerrant. And
So one more time, I disagree. No, that's why you look at genre and you take case-by-case example. You don't have to care about the inerrancy stuff at all. Even if you thought the Bible was full of errors, it does not follow from that Christianity is false. It does not follow from that Jesus didn't exist, teach about the kingdom of God, die on the cross. You have to look at those particular instances and then decide if those parts of the Gospels are false. And I've never read anything close to disproving those key elements of the Christian proclamation.
if you start to realize that it's not inerrant, or there are contradictions or are errors, then to me, that's not something that you can just accept lightly. To me, there's massive implications from that, to the point where maybe you can't trust this book at all. So I realized this one day, and so I started to look to see if there were errors. Were there contradictions? And much to my surprise, when I started researching this, you can actually look for yourself. There's all these people that are claiming all these contradictions and errors in the Bible. And one by one, if you research each of these contradictions, you'll get people pointing out the error of the contradiction, but then you'll get people explaining the contradictions away. But again, it sort of seemed, in some of these issues for me, it seemed like those mental backflips again. Like, for example, I'll give a really simple example. There's complex examples in the Bible. There's all kinds of contradictions that you can look up or potential errors. But here's a really simple one. It almost seems, inconsequential. It's so simple. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus was crucified on the third hour. So that's Mark 15:25. So that's basically just saying what time of day Jesus was crucified, in the third hour. So in the Gospel of John, which is a different book, it says that Pilate sentenced Jesus to death on about the 6th hour. And that's John 19:14. There's also another contradiction in there about the day that Jesus was crucified. One says, was it before Passover? One.
So that's right. So Mark in the Synoptics says basically that means around 9 a.m. and that he dies around noon. He dies around midday. In John's Gospel, he has Jesus get crucified around then and dies a little longer because that seems to have been around the time they slaughtered the lambs for Passover. So that's why most historians or scholars would concur that John has pushed the timing a little different to symbolically associate the death of Jesus with the slaughter of the called Paschal or the Passover lambs.
One says it was after Passover. But I'm going to focus on this time thing for a minute. So this might seem really insignificant to a lot of people. It's like, oh, big deal. Who cares what time and day Jesus was crucified? I would also agree. It doesn't really matter for the general story. However, it raises this one point, is there is a contradiction here. One says that he was crucified in the 3rd hour. The second one says he wasn't even sentenced until the 6th hour, and then he was crucified sometime after. So what you have here is 2 books of the Bible. They're saying different things. And so it's a tiny little contradiction that might not matter. However, this is my question when I read little things like this. So although if you actually look this up on the internet, you will find explanations about why people say this. They're like, well, back in the day, time wasn't as strict as it is now. They basically did this sort of like, quarters of the day, like a morning, mid-morning, afternoon, mid-afternoon, evening kind of thing. And So really, this is just kind of a very abstract concept, time. And I go, okay, well, that makes sense if a man wrote it. But if you are a God writing a book that's meant to be read 2,000 years later, I mean, you're going to know that time becomes an important thing. So why would you, as a God that is writing a book that is inerrant, why would you put something that was a plain inconsistency? Why would you get those two times wrong?
Yeah, so it's problematic in your understanding of the term inerrant. And that's fair enough. And your particular, what worldview or view of inerrancy is, that's right. You would have a particular view. But if you think God dropped the Bible out of heaven, or you have, it's a kind of plenary inspiration, that is to say that a dictation theory of it, rather, is probably more accurate. That is, God took over the author, they're kind of in a trance, and they just wrote whatever God. That is a view. The Bible never says that, but that is a view of inerrancy and inspiration. I don't hold that view. I think it's fair to say most inerrantists don't have that view either. They believe that God used human agency to write out things in their culture the best they can. They allowed genre to be one of the models that God let a human being like Mark write his document in the genre of ancient bios on purpose. And so that allows distinctions in the text. But in your view, it may be very, very problematic. I just don't have your view, never have had your view.
One of them is right, one of them is wrong. They can't both be right unless you sort of accept this, well, it doesn't really matter. It's just sort of inconsequential. People didn't take time seriously back then.
I think they took time seriously. Yes, they understood it differently. We also have some evidence that, of course, the calendar system was quite different. This is way before the Gregorian calendar took over. You have a Roman calendar, but the Jews themselves had a different calendar, the lunar calendar. And so we do get problematic when it comes to knowing the exact timing, whether in Galilee or Judea, whether it's a Roman controlled place or not. It just, how influenced they are by Greek or Latin. And it can be pretty complex, and we don't know for sure, but they took time pretty seriously, but it was different. So for example, we know for a fact it still is this way in the lunar calendar, the Jewish, strict Jewish calendar. Back then, the day was from basically sunset to sunset. When the sun went down, it started a new day. So we would call, as did Jesus, so Jesus died on a Friday. All four Gospels agree he died on a Friday. All four agree with that. They disagree upon what the day is. Did it start or was the middle of or closing Passover, or the day before Passover, the day Passover started? They all agree it's on a Friday, though. And so the issue is what do we call that day? And this is where it does get problematic, because we don't have exact measurements of, do they have in mind sunset on the day before, like it's Thursday afternoon? Or was it what they would call Friday, even though it means it's sunset, but we would still call Thursday night, because it's when the sun goes down, and it does become complex, but not because it's just an abstract time.
See, for me, I started to think, that's a contradiction. And if there was a God, let's say this is a God-inspired book, at the very least, he could get details like that correct. At the very least, he would know that this book's going to be around for at least a couple thousand years. Who knows?
Right, if God wrote it. But I don't think God wrote the Bible.
How long will humanity survive? It could be around in another 1,000 years from now.
Yeah.
If it was inerrant, why wouldn't those two things be the same? And so there's lots of other examples, little things like this. There's just one example, actually, it's off the top of my head, so I don't know.
So what would follow from that? The only thing that would follow, let's assume he's right. Let's assume he's right, that is a contradiction. Okay. What follows from that? God doesn't exist? No, that doesn't make any sense. Christianity is false? No, that doesn't make any sense. Jesus never existed, taught about the kingdom of God? No, 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 no. All that follows is that your understanding of inerrancy is false, or two, the Bible, which you just keep treating as one book over and over, and it's not a book, it's a library. All that would follow is the one or two of the documents you are reading, or any documents, the number of documents that are talking about that event, that those documents do not fit your definition of inerrant. That's all that follows. Every other document in the library could be inerrant, just not those. Or just not those paragraphs, or just not those facts. My point is, all kinds of things could possibly follow, but what does not follow is Christianity is false.
Oh, the reference, but Paul starts off the first verse of a chapter saying, one thing, and then he goes, oh, actually, yeah, and then he says something else. And I've heard the reason why he did that. He actually contradicts himself in a previous verse. He says something, and then he corrects himself, which is normal speech, right? And the reason that I've heard for this is that,
I want to fast forward a little bit, and he's coming to a conclusion, okay, I think the Bible's not inspired.
Maybe it was written down by men, an account of what Jesus said. And so around this time, how did I deal with this issue? I redefined the Bible, not to be the thing itself it's almost like I've noticed that some people almost treat the Bible as the religion. It's almost like they worship the Bible itself. Here is the Word of God. They elevate this Word of God, and they worship it instead of God.
I agree. There are certain people who do that. That's called bibliolatry. That's right. They treat the Bible as like the fourth member of the Trinity. I agree. They should not do that.
There's a word that's actually for that. It's called a Biblion. And it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek word. Nobody admits to being a Biblion. But the general idea is that you worship the Bible instead of the God behind the Bible. So I started to realize that maybe this Bible did have errors in it. Maybe...
I want to fast forward just a little bit because it doesn't say much that's important about why I left Christianity. He's going to talk about here in a second of why did the Bible get created.
And to be honest, I was slightly disappointed in kind of what I found. So for example, the earliest gospel of Jesus was written at least 50 years after Jesus' death. The others were written, past that. And
so when you say I discovered that, what do you mean you discovered that? How do you know when the gospel's written? How do you know that? What evidence do you have to know when the gospel's written? I really mean that. Because I don't know. I mean, that's one of my fields of specialty, and I don't know of any reason I know when it happened. Scholars make conjectures, and it's true that most scholars think that the Gospel of Mark was written probably the late 60s, mid to late 60s, maybe around 80, 70. And almost every scholar agrees that everyone does, that Jesus either died 80-30 or 80-33. We can know that for a fact based on a few reasons. But so let's say it's 30 at the earliest, and let's say it's 68, 69 at the latest of Mark. That's virtually synonymous scholarship. I don't think it's that late. I think Mark was written more in the 50s. But let's assume the late dating. That's 38 years. That's 37. It's not 50 years. But you would need to know that. You need to know for a fact. Well, if we know it's 50 years, we don't know that. There's arguments for it.
It's funny. I never really thought about this as a Christian. Like, I assumed that, the disciples who were with Jesus wrote down his teachings after his death. But that's actually not true. The Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they weren't even written by the disciples. Matthew wasn't actually written by Matthew because, earliest could have been 50 years, let's say. And so, I don't know about you.
You don't know. How could you possibly know that? How could you possibly know that? In fact, virtually almost all New Testament scholars concur that we know this from multiple reasons, and some of it's from the Mishnah, which is a little bit later, but almost everyone agrees that the rabbis had disciples. The disciples were well known. They were required to memorize the teaching of the masters. Rabbi means my great one, of the rabbis, the teachers, and Greek didaskalos, their teacher. But also we know for a fact that many of them also they actually wrote down the teachings of the teacher. So it is very likely that people like Matthew, who was, of course, almost certainly one of the original apostles, and I say almost certainly, we don't know because he doesn't say, the four Gospels don't say, hi, I'm Matthew, I'm the Matthew in a little bit. Coming up, it was chapter 3, 4, where I get called and I'm his disciple. He doesn't say that. That's why I can't say we're sure, but almost certainly that he is the one, and he was, of all the documents that are the most, quote, Jewish, the most concerned about Old Testament prophecy, it's this one. It does make sense, if you read it that way, that Matthew does make sense. We don't know for sure. But what we don't know for sure is that he didn't write it. So when you say he didn't do it, you need evidence for that. You would need evidence that Matthew did not write Matthew. You don't have it. I know that because it's my field. There's no you don't have it.
But to me, this created a massive problem. How can you accurately write down somebody's words like 50 years to 100 years by the time the letter was written after a person says them?
Good question.
So I heard this analogy not too long ago, and it was like, can you imagine if, take a president, JFK, his commencement speech that he gives? It would be like me right now trying to write down his words word for word. However, I have no recordings. I have no written records of what he said. All I really have is hearsay. And I might be able to find somebody who was there, but that person would be extremely old. Probably not at this point. I would probably have to know somebody who knew somebody that was there. And so you would also have this sort of oral culture that had developed around the teachings. And so, who knows? You've had let's say 50 years of people kind of repeating what Jesus said. And if you ever played that game Telephone as a kid where you go around the circle, you realize that things get convoluted as people pass them along. And, I've heard arguments, just in case somebody throws this at me, that back then they were an oral culture. They were much more careful with it. But then, I've also read things that are basically the actual words, the intricacies of the syntax weren't as important back then, and the general ideas and the stories, and that's what was important. So that's why maybe Jesus spoke in parables so much, is because parables were something that could be remembered, right? So anyway, I kind of realized through that study that...
Okay, this is a big topic, and it's certainly a hot topic in New Testament studies. It's been a hot topic for a while, but particularly since, I would argue, probably since Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, it's the biggest. Yeah, he really just stirred up the pot, which is in a great way. In general, most New Testament scholars agree that that the earliest message of Jesus was, you had it right for a little bit, which is almost certainly based on the text itself, based on inside evidence, and based on probably implications of various things in the text, based on how Mediterranean culture worked back then, based on the evidence we had back then, and how Mediterranean culture works today. We put all these pieces together. What makes the most sense is that we have some of a fluid but controlled oral tradition. So the stories of Jesus almost certainly were repeated over and over and over and over and over in these churches, in these house churches, and books like Acts demonstrate over and over and over. They go back to Jerusalem, and these Jesus stories would have passed over and over and over and over and over and over and repeated. And these people would have, they're locked into place so much as any oral tradition does. Most of the time, at least the gist gets locked in, and then it's repeated over and over and over by the storytellers of the congregations. Whenever there's a doubt, they go back to the living witness, and that's what they called eyewitnesses in the first century. They called them, and like people like Polybius, he said it's very, very important when you write your documents, you have to go back to an eyewitness as much as possible. And eyewitnesses can be wrong, there's no doubt about that, but the point is you want to go back to the earliest if you can. In fact, that's one of the reasons why most scholars would agree that the Gospels did get composed, is because people within the eyewitness, that is, people who actually heard Jesus, not eyewitnesses to a grandparent, but eyewitnesses and ear witnesses to the teaching of Jesus, were dying off. And I do think that's one of the reasons why the Gospels were getting composed, is because the first generation disciples of Jesus were dying off. So back to the analogy you gave, is there was a people who repeated over. That's exactly right. The telephone analogy is completely wrong. It's completely disanalogous. The telephone assumes you're not repeating it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. So, for example, the so-called telephone game in Britain, they call it Chinese whispers, bunch of racists. But the telephone game is when you tell a person, I like green apples, and they tell over and over and over and over and over and over, and you hope 50 people later they got it right. I eat cats for breakfast. And that's so funny. No. It's much like me saying, I like green apples. I like green apples. I like green apples. He likes green apples. David likes green. David likes green apples. He tells him green apples. Hey, now I'm the 8th person. Hi, I'm David. I like green apples. You like green apples? That's what I heard. David likes green apples. Green apple. Now how likely is by the 50th person, when I've repeated it over and over and over and over and over and over, and I've said it, and when there's any doubt or different, they come talk to me. No, I like green apples. I never said I eat cats for breakfast. Not only did it happen in oral traditions, it happened, we know, from the manuscripts like Tertullian, who said that when there's distinctions in the manuscripts, that the copies they had, this is around the 8200, he says you go back and see the original ones, which means you could have gone to the churches in Corinth and have seen some of the original or the first copies of Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And he might have written 4 at least, but certainly at least 3, because in 1 Corinthians 5:9 he says, in the previous letter I wrote to you, then we have 1 Corinthians, we have 2. So really 1 and 2 Corinthians are really 2 and 3 Corinthians, and it depends on how you break down in 2 Corinthians. Some think that 10 through 12 is a separate document, but that's debated fine. All that to say, Tertullian is evidence they could go back to the original manuscripts in the first time. This is not the telephone game at all. So I understand the point you're making if it was a telephone game. If you heard something all those years ago and then you had to write it down right now from memory, that is problematic. It doesn't mean you get it all wrong. It would be problematic. That's right, unless you had a really, really good memory. But before I move on past this, and I've said this stuff in other books before, and I've said it on podcasts, but before we quickly dismiss people from a long time ago, you have to remember, as everybody who specializes in memory recollection, that we remember things that have the most emotional attachment to it. So things that were as traumatic or very celebratory, a lot of joy, or things that are very, well, again, trauma is a big one, a lot of fear involved, adrenaline. It imprints it on the mind, and I would say even the gray matter of the brain, much better, particularly olfactory glands, the smelling glands. We associate memories with smell the strongest and experience. And it's very, very different from something your teacher said in 5th grade in history class. I don't know what she said. But the day your child is born, the first time you went to jail, the first time so-and-so was healed in front of you miraculously, you can replay it almost to the T. Memory's not perfect. Everyone knows that. You can read all the studies you want. Everyone knows that. But everybody knows that things that have strong traumatic or emotional things are much more likely to be embedded in the mind. Secondly, and as soon as they happen fresh, if you retell the story fresh, it's much more likely, you retell it, it gets locked in. And so Having said that, not everything has to have a strong traumatic memory, but it's amazing how you can do this. I saw this TV show a while back. It was a documentary of this woman in her upper 90s, and she used to go to the speakeasies, which is during the Great Depression. Around then the prohibition was going on, and the prohibition outlawed alcohol, of course. But she recalled going, I think it was in New York, where she remembers an exact speakeasy. She described the front door, she described the color and the paint and where it went. And as she's saying this, and she's 500 years old, as she's saying this in this documentary, they're putting old pictures up there. And it's identical to what she said. Now it's possible you say, well, David, she looked at all those pictures all over again and she did it. That's possible, but that's not how they presented it all in the documentary. And many, I can go on for a long time. She went in, what it was like, what the guys used to wear, what they drank, da-da-da-da-da. The same thing happens when it comes to the concentration camps. When you have Jews that came out of Auschwitz, people, to this day, people in World War II, what was it like to go to D-Day? They can recount in enormous detail what happened because it's so traumatizing, so emotional. They will break down in tears. And I saw Jimmy's arm fall off. He got shot. Then I fell on the ground and so hard me, blah, blah. Now, their memory is not impeccable for hours, but these moments, these episodic events are very memorable. And that is one of the reasons why, almost certainly, why Jesus spoke in parables. Because they're episodic stories that people can recall, not long paragraphs or dissertations like I tend to talk in. He was much, much better at teaching than I am, and told parables and told quick analogies that people will, of course, get their point.
There is no evidence that the Bible is accurate and reliable. There's no evidence that says that what is written down in there is actually what Jesus taught. I mean, sure, I think...
that's just ridiculous. That's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. That would mean we'd have zero corroboration of every single thing attested in the New Testament or the Gospels. That there's no evidence for Jerusalem existing in the first century. I mean, that's absurd. It's absurd to think Galilee didn't exist, and that we have done archaeological digs for centuries. We know they existed. So that's silly to think we have no evidence. And you say no evidence of what Jesus taught. Well, then you have to say what Jesus taught. What do you mean by that? Do you mean outside of the historical documents of the Gospels and the Apostle Paul when he quotes from Jesus, and from the second century church fathers who quote from Jesus, like Ignatius and so forth? So there's no evidence? Okay, but that's the case. We need to dismiss every single thing ever written in the history of the world outside of archaeological cities that are coins that have been discovered. We don't know anything, because you can't trust anybody. You can't trust Polybius, you can't trust Cicero, you can't trust Plutarch, you can't trust... Why? Because only those ancient documents written about what they said are what we have. And unless we have it written in stone, maybe, archaeological record, but you could still say someone chiseled that stone in yesterday, or they made it look old, and we don't know if that's authentic. In fact, that's why it looks like the literary documents, because they chiseled that in stone to make it look like a document we already have. I guess you could dismiss everything, but you would have to dismiss everything. But see, historians don't do that. We don't dismiss everything just because we don't have something etched in stone.
Probably safe to assume you'll get some kind of semblance of it, but to the level of detail that most Christians think, where it's this word-for-word account, I just can't find any evidence for that. The only way that you could believe that would be if you believe that it was God-breathed. But then I have a...
Okay, so that means you think Lincoln never gave the Gettysburg Address. That means you think almost everything that has ever been said ever in the history of the world was never really said, because there's no evidence for it. All we have is documents where they wrote it out. And since we don't have audio recordings of it, that kind of historical skepticism is very popular on YouTube, but not in the real world historical work. You can't... And that would be silly to throw out everything that has ever been said ever in a document. You need reasons to find it unpersuasive. That is to say, let's say a document talks about something. A document says there were unicorns in this mountain, and here are the bones, and you go there, there's no bones. I mean, it has to be, there's a city that lives right here, and there's no evidence ever in the historical record ever. And we have counter evidence that was a river basin, or I don't know. My point is, you'd have to need evidence for that disconfirms it before you throw it all out. You don't trust everything, but you have to have evidence to disconfirm it, that's for sure.
Problem with that, because if it was God-breathed, why wouldn't it be more cohesive? Why wouldn't it be more coherent? Why contradictions?
We're back to that.
Why is everything so vague? And this kind of comes down to a fundamental question I have, and it's more of a logic question.
Good.
Let's say there was a God, and he created this universe.
Yes.
The intensity of this universe and the logical systems that run that universe, like math, chemistry, physics, biology, there's these clear logical rules, biology, and how these things work in cells. And, the cell, it's this tiny little building block, and they all work together with all the other cells to create these complex organisms. But then you actually look inside of a cell, and the complexity that is inside that cell, it is very ordered and very logical. And so this was one of my main questions. Why would a God that appears to be so logical, so smart enough to create all this, why does he resort to this book that is just this jumble of things written over centuries? It wasn't a cohesive book. It appears to be written by men with errors. There's no evidence that it actually is accurate. There's no evidence that what it says is true. I mean, there's so many books out there. I mean, all religions have religious texts. So this is another thing it comes down to. Well, the Quran is a religious text.
Yeah, Paul's, I mean, I don't keep saying, because I've already said my response to all that is, yeah, if I believed all that too, I wouldn't believe it either. If I believe that the Bible fell from heaven, from God, and there's no evidence whatsoever that any of it's true, why believe it? I agree with you. I think that'd be absurd to believe in such a religion. I think all that's completely false.
I mean, there's Hindu texts, Buddhist texts.
Mm-hmm.
Every religion has texts, and they all believe them as true. But then when I actually look, well, why should I believe that this particular one is the true one?
Yep.
Unfortunately, I just couldn't find a valid reason. I couldn't find.
Okay, well, I did, and I have. That's why I'm still a Christian. That is evidence to me. That's a difference. Why I'm not a Buddhist or a Hindu.
A reason why this is true. And the problem is, if you can't find a reason why the Bible is true, then everything else is almost inconsequential. You can't believe what it says in here if you have no reason to believe that the words themselves are the Word of God. And so,
it still doesn't follow from that Christianity is false. No, it would mean you wouldn't trust the Bible to be historically accurate in any form, in any book it has. It does not follow from that Jesus didn't exist, didn't die on the cross. Doesn't follow from that. You would need reasons to think that's false.
I went through this really awkward time where I gave myself permission to question a lot of these things. And I started questioning almost everybody I knew that was a Christian to kind of answer some core questions. And I was kind of like sorely disappointed. It seemed like nobody that I knew that was a Christian had real reasons why they believed it.
I so agree. That is sad and frustrating to me. I'm serious. Yep.
And so I actually ended up writing Bruxy a letter. So there's a guy that's like pretty famous. He goes around and speaks all over the world. He's got like church with 4,000 people. And I wrote him a letter.
I don't know who he is.
He knew some of my core questions, and he wrote me back.
And I love that. I love the fact that you wrote him questions. I love it. I wish people would do this more often and really keep pursuing. And people have heard me on the podcast for a long time. I get disappointed and frustrated when Christians don't ask that. Just pray, just believe. That frustrates me. So I'm so glad he did this.
Although he had the most cohesive response of anybody, it wasn't satisfying to me. I don't know how. I don't want to pretend, I guess. I don't want to pretend that something is valid when it's not. That something makes sense when it doesn't. So I started to ask people this question.
Amen.
If I woke up one day and I'd lost my memory, say I'd had amnesia, I couldn't remember anything, including what I believed. So I have all these Christian friends, but I don't even remember why I was a Christian. I don't remember why this is true. Why did I believe this? What would you tell me? What reasons would you have to convince me that Christianity was the real one and all the other choices, like let's say, if I want to be a Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu or Hare Krishna or Judaism or Mormon, or Jehovah's Witness, or what do you have to say about your choice of faith? Why should I pick that one over the other ones? And I think it's an interesting question because it forces people not to prove the existence of God, but to prove the exact flavor of God.
Okay, so to me, the more important question isn't what would Christians say to you. The more question is, how do you determine that? What would you do? So when I had my 2 crises of faith, like you have here too in your video, I had 2 of those. And while I was an undergraduate student and then when I was a master's student in biblical studies. So what I decided was to figure out if the core pillar beliefs as each religion taught them. I say each. I didn't examine 5,000 religions, but I did about 5 or 6 major ones, including atheism, which is not a religion, and other things. I looked at their core things they believe and taught. I remember thinking, I don't want to create caricatures of them, and I don't want to chase after silly nonsense like picking out every single contradiction in the Quran, though I think that is very problematic for a Muslim because they do believe God wrote it. They think Allah speaks in Arabic. It's very problematic for them. It's not problematic to me because I don't think God wrote the Bible. I think God worked through people to write the Bible. So that's what I did. I didn't care what other Christians did. I cared what I would do. And so the answer for me is evidence. So evidence. And so I thought, well, are there reasons to believe this? Are there good reasons to believe in Judaism? Are there good reasons to believe in Islam? Are there good reasons to believe in Christianity, and I didn't want to be duped. I don't believe in something stupid. So I have such affinity with this guy. I really do. It sounds like to me he didn't have any good guides and keep reading from good people. And I had, God bless me with good guides, really, really, really bright people, and who also sent me on to read other bright people. And I read and I read and I read and I read, and that helped me a whole lot.
I think that trying to prove the existence of God at all is, well, it's not really possible. I mean, I've spent 10 years digging through all the reasons about trying to prove God, and all of them, in my opinion, there's no valid evidence, there's no real proof to even prove that there is a God. Let's just say for a moment there was, and now we know there's a God. At that point, how do you choose which flavor of God?
And I'm not, I looked for 10 years. That's great. I mean, did you get I'm not saying, are you a scholar? Like, have you studied at the master PhD level? Have you toured the world? Have you read 100 books from the top level philosophers, atheistic and Christian and I'm Jewish too? Have you, or did you just read some books and go on YouTube and listen to podcasts and just think about it? I mean, that's the kind of stuff I hear all the time. People, I mean, I read for years. I go, yeah, I mean, yeah, I can read for years too and read crap. So I don't know. I just wonder so far I've not heard a lot of input from stuff that sound like you've got formal education. That makes me go, I don't know. I wonder. And of course, and then which God? Let's see.
I mean, there's hundreds, there could be thousands of different versions. And I find it a little too convenient that most people happen to believe the version that they were brought up with.
Yeah, so now you're committing you're about to commit the genetic fallacy, if that's what you mean. So it's true, that's right, there are different understandings of who God is. It does not follow from that God doesn't exist. So how would I answer that question? Evidence, that's all, evidence. If Jesus really existed, and we have reason to think he really existed, and we have really, really good reasons to think Jesus really existed from ancient documents, that if you dismiss out, well, because they're not inspired, well then, okay, you can do that. Nobody does that in the historical world. Nobody does that. You can do that if you want to do. I don't do that. I don't dismiss things because I don't dismiss an historical document because someone thinks God wrote it. It is an ancient document, and we want to read it regardless of what Bobby and Sue think about it. With the Book of Mormon, it's religious, it's God's inspired. I don't give a crap what you call it. This was written by a guy who lived in the 19th century and who has a history of being a criminal. But whatever it is, there's a real history here that we can examine this document, and it does fit into the life of a person who wrote in a kind of English style who lived in the 19th century in New England. And it doesn't matter if you think it's inspired or not. It is an ancient document, and for us we call ancient, so now read it. It is irrelevant. And so then the question is, well, did he have an accurate grasp of who God is? Do we have good evidence to believe, to have good reason to think that Joseph Smith got his understanding of God correctly? If the answer is no, I move on. If the answer is yes, I stick with him or keep moving on to someone who might have a better answer. Well, that's what I did with the Gospels. And I think the Gospels can be trusted enough to give us the life and teachings of Jesus, and the death and resurrection of Jesus, I think, are the best historically accurate things to believe in because of the Gospels. That's the answer. I completely agree with you that it's important for people like you and me to look for evidences. A lot of people don't care about that. They don't. They just want to feel it. And that's fine. That's their shtick. It's not my shtick. I'm much more skeptical. And so I have so much affinity with my maybe future friend here. I really, really do. But that's the answer, is you look at evidence. And so if Jesus really said the things he said, if he really did the things he did, if he really was resurrected, I mean, I'm going to listen to anybody who's resurrected. I'm going to listen to him. And that's why. That's why.
So most Christians...
Genetic fallacy. Most people who grew up and become Christians, their parents are Christian. That's exactly right. But it does not follow from that, therefore it's false. If you say someone believes X because they believe, here I can explain their origin of the belief, therefore X is false. That's the textbook definition of the genetic fallacy. It's a formal logical fallacy. The genetic fallacy, that is to say, you cannot decide whether a propositional statement is false by determining where they got the belief. If it's let's say, for example, I don't know, let's say that the number one college football team in the land right now is University of Alabama. I don't know, let's assume it's Alabama, because they won the national championship. And I go, hey, I think Alabama's the best team. And you go, what? I say, Alabama's the best top-ranked team. You go, of course you think that. You went to the University of Alabama. And your parents went to the University of Alabama. Of course you believe that. That doesn't follow that Alabama's not the top-ranked team. So that's a genetic fallacy.
Christians are Christians because they were brought up as Christians. Most Muslims are Muslims.
And most atheists are atheists because their parents are atheists. Therefore, atheism is false?
Because they were brought up as Muslims. Most, people live in India and they were brought up in Hinduism, they're just not Christians by accident. It would be very difficult for them to become a Christian because, first of all, there's nobody indoctrinating with the ideas. So this is the question I asked. Another version of the question that I asked was, if I was an alien, just showed up on Earth today, and I was trying to decide which religion was true, what would you say to convince me of your religion? So I started asking this question to almost everybody I know. And if any of my friends are watching this, you'll probably know. And this question got heated at times, and people get frustrated because they'll say stuff and I'm like, okay, well, that's not a valid reason because of X, Y, and Z. Like, do you have an actual reason? And I noticed this trend as I went through this thought experiment. I didn't find a single person that had a real reason. Not even one person. Every single person, the reason that they used was experience. It was, I knew somebody one time and he had a tumor and he prayed and it went away. Or, I prayed for this and I got it, therefore God. And I'm not trying to discount experience, but
yeah, you are.
People can use experience to justify just about anything. I mean,
yeah.
One thing I really started to notice was, like, for example, I was following a hardcore Catholic on Twitter.
Pause there for a second. See, I hear you. Yeah, that's, man. Let's assume for a second you've never been to Disney World. Never heard of it. And I have been to Disney World. I've been there. I've experienced Disney World. And besides going bankrupt, it was really fun. I enjoyed it. I've been a few times, in fact. It's fun. I can describe what I did. I can describe the rides. I can describe some of the conversations. I can describe some events that took place. I can describe what being there with my family who was there. And I come back and describe that, and you go, what? Where's your evidence? Where's your reason? Not that you would say it that way. You'd be very kind about it. I'm sure courteous. David, what is your evidence that Disney World is a real place? And I would say, what do you mean, what evidence? Yeah, what evidence? I need real evidence. What's your reason? If you were trying to prove to me a Disney World exists, what's your proof of that? I would say, my proof of that. Well, I went there. I've experienced. Yeah, I don't care, David, you're stupid. Or you can say, David, you're delusional. To that, I would say, you're right, I could be. Yeah, that's right. I've said this I've said in my books. That's right. And I would say, you need to read my books. That's right, I could be delusional. And you say, David, do you have any concrete evidence? Well, I've got this map from Disney World. Oh, you made that up on the way. That's Photoshop. Anybody can do that. Okay, well, here's my wife and my kids. They went there too. Oh, that's collusion. You just told them ahead of time. Okay. I've got pictures on my camera. That's stupid Photoshop. That's AI. I can do that on ChatGPT. Okay. I've got this whole narrative of a Mickey Mouse character. Ever heard about him? No, that's right. Fine. I can make up stories too. David, none of these are real reasons. So it sounds to me that the real thing you're trying to tell me is that Disney World exists because you've experienced it. And I would say, well, yeah, that is the main reason I know it's real, is because I had experienced it myself. That's what the most core, how I know that I know that I know. It's not because of a map. It's not because of my kids' stories. It's not because of a comic book or cartoon. It's because of my experience of it. And that works. I'm warranted in that belief. The only time you would have the rational reason to debunk my view of Disney World is if this. You would have to have a defeater. You have to be able to discorroborate what I'm saying. You say, David, where is this place? Where's this magical Mickey Mouse place? I would say it's just outside of Orlando, Florida, North Orlando. Orlando? I've been to Orlando, David. There is no Disney World. I'll say it's just outside Orlando. I've been everywhere. I have flown over with airplanes. There's no evidence anywhere of this place that you're talking about. And I'll say that's problematic. And you say, David, look, here's maps. Show me on a map. Pull up Google Maps. I'll type in Disney. How's it spelled? Let's do every language we know. Are you the only? No, other people said they've been to Disney World, but David's no maps. Nobody. Let's go to Florida and interview people. No one thinks Disney World even exists. That would be a defeater. And that's how we know the distinction between a delusion versus reality. That is it. And that is outside corroborating experience. That is what psychologists use to know if something is objective. You don't have the exact same experience, but you need to have no experience of. If no one had met my wife, Emma Lane, nobody ever met her, and there's no record of her ever, but I keep talking about her, and no one's ever met her, no one's ever seen her, there's no pictures, that'd be problematic. I might suffer from a delusion. That's a real deal. But if I could go to a map, and I could point out a place called Disney World, and I could pull up a website called Disney World, and I meshed that corroborating evidence with experience, I mean, that's it. What else? I mean, that's it. That's it. But one more time, to prove that I'm delusional, you need discorroborating evidence, not a lack of evidence. Not a lack of evidence. Discorroborating evidence. That's how you prove Santa is not real. Not the normal American Santa Claus. He lives in the North Pole. We've been to the North Pole. No, there's no Santa factory there. There's no Santa factory. And that's the story, is that there's a Santa factory. We've been there. That discorroborates the story. I've experienced North Pole. Well, okay, you need meds. but that doesn't mean it's real. And so I don't dismiss experience apparently like you do right away. That would be, well, that's ridiculous. You don't need experience. You need to dismiss experience when we have discorroborating evidence that it cannot be true. For example, in the Book of Mormonism, I saw the golden plates and blah, blah, blah. And in the golden plates, it tells these stories of these great 2 lost tribes of Hebrew. No, there's no evidence. So the point is you would have to have discorroborating evidence. So the only point I'm trying to make is I don't dismiss experience like you do. I want to hear what a person's experience is. And if I have discorroborating evidence, I go, well, then you're delusional. If I don't have evidence, I go, that sounds okay, unless I really trust the person. I'd say, well, I don't need evidence. I've never been to Canada. I think Canada is real. I think the videos are right, they're true. I trust them. That person seems trustworthy. Maybe this person otherwise is a liar. Well, I don't trust them. Maybe they suffer from schizophrenia. Then I'm being a suspect. But I don't dismiss experience out of hand. I listen to them, and I listen for some reasons to think that their experience can be corroborated. And in my view, that's exactly why I'm a Christian. I have a religious experience that is corroborated by the historical claims of Christianity. And that's, of course, where you disagree. You think there's not a shred of reason to believe that the Bible, the entire library of the Bible, the Protestant canon alone is 66 books. And I find that overwhelmingly unconvincing. So that's where we really, really part ways. I'm going to fast forward to hear some more complaints he has.
And I just started to see patterns. Another pattern that I noticed was an actual logical fallacy, which is they would say things like, well, how else do you explain that? Like, I know one person, they had this experience in the shower, this complete emotional breakdown experience. And he thought it was God coming to finally wake him up. And of course, he then took that as Jesus and Christianity, and this is the version of God that came to me and whatever. And after he told me that, I sort of said a few things, and he said, well, how else do you explain it? And this is the thing. That is the reason that is used a lot. Here's this thing that happened, and I'm just going to assign a reason to that, or assign a meaning, because how else can you explain it? And this is the reason why that actually is a logical fallacy. I heard one analogy. Let's say you have a dog and the dog runs into your house, it's soaking wet, and it's getting water over your house, and you're annoyed, and you're like trying to figure out, well, why is the dog wet? But you're not outside. You don't know why the dog is wet, right? So you say, well, the only reason is it must be raining. So it must be rain inside. And then you don't bother to go outside and look and check. So now from then on, you believe that the dog was wet because it was raining. The reason why this is a logical fallacy is because you can't assume that. There's other reasons why the dog was wet. Maybe your neighbor had a hose and sprayed the dog. Maybe there was a puddle and the dog rolled around the puddle. Maybe a truck drove by and somebody dumped some water on the dog. Maybe you could invent any number of reasons, from very plausible to utterly ridiculous. But you can't assume that it was raining. The problem I've noticed with most religions is that the reason they assign isn't even the most likely scenario. Like, for example, you see it a lot in non-religious things as well. Like, somebody sees a light in the sky, and the first thing they think is, it's an alien. Well, how else do you explain that? It's an alien. And it's like, well, why don't we look at the more probable explanations before we just jump to these massive conclusions that's an alien? Like, oh, is there a balloon up there floating with a light on it? There's, of course, lots of explanations for that. But what is it about people that immediately jump to one particular conclusion with no evidence and then believe that wholeheartedly, and then at that point accept that belief with such rigidity that they will not accept any further explanation or evidence?
Yeah, that's called confirmation bias. That's why they do it. So it's not a logical fallacy. It's a misunderstanding of abductive reasoning. So if a person said the dog came in and was wet because of that reason, right, it'd be a falsus. It would be not true that that's the necessary conclusion, because it could be those other things. That's true. And there are people, I don't know about your friend who said I had the shower experience and that must have been Jesus. I don't know their experience, but there are people I've met and read about and seen and heard who things like that have happened to them. It's not because they go, it could have been alien. It's because of the actual encounter itself. There's something in the encounter that they know that Jesus met them. Sometimes it's a vision. That happens all over the Muslim world. They have dreams of Jesus, or they have visions of Jesus. This is documented around the globe. Or people have died and come back and they meet Jesus. Sometimes they have visions we're in the shower. Sometimes they feel like someone's met them, and it's hard to articulate unless you've experienced it. So sometimes maybe it is they just throw their hands up and go, that's the only thing I know about is Jesus. It must be Jesus. I'm sure there's people who do that. But there's a lot of other people who don't do that. It's because they have been met by a person called Jesus. That's the answer. But for those that just put into a framework they already know, that's just confirmation bias. They already know something, and they've put in the puzzle piece, and that's what humans do. Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to fast forward a little bit.
And so I think at its core, that makes me an atheist, which is a weird thing to admit, because that word carries so many connotations. But in the end, I have to ask myself, what kind of person do I want to be? I don't want to be closed off to new things. I don't want to be closed off to new evidence. I want to be able to update my beliefs as they come along. And I think the thing that allows me to do that the most is calling myself a not theist, an atheist. And why am I doing this video? It's not to like try to convert somebody, change somebody's mind. The real reason is, as I've gone through this process, it's been incredibly difficult. And I've been, as you change your worldview, it can create all kinds of problems. A lot of those, you've got a table with legs and you're ripping legs off your table and you're teetering. I've gone through deep depressions, existential crises over these issues as I re-question the meaning of the world. Mm-hmm. How do I resolve myself in this world without these beliefs? So the reason why I do it is because there have been a few key people that I found along the way that have given me some semblance of comfort, and I'm not alone. I'm not a crazy person for thinking this. And so that's why I'm doing this video. Maybe there's somebody out there that this validates your own internal logic, that there's things that you can't go along with anymore. And I'm just here.
Well, I mean, that sounds dangerously close to telling me that the reason why I did this video is because you had an experience of being comforted by other atheists. I mean, where's your evidence? Where are your reasons for doing this? It can't be your experience that you were comforted, because you don't do that. You only follow evidence, not experience.
Here to say it's okay to think those things. It's okay to explore what you think is true. A lot of people can't do it. Most people can't. Once they accept the belief and it becomes part of their identity, it becomes non-negotiable. I don't want to be that kind of person.
Good.
So that's what this whole journey to me is about.
Thank you so much for watching this. If you're like this guy, you're a lot like me. I'm a very skeptical person. I went through 2 seasons like this. He's exactly right. The depression, the existential crisis, those feelings are real, which again, he cares about those experiences he just said. Of course he does. He doesn't need evidence that he was having an existential crisis. He was having it. It was a first-person subjective experience of something that was very upsetting. And I believe him. I don't need any reasons to believe him besides what he just said. That's right. I just trust him on his word that he's not being delusional when he had these crises of faith. And I absolutely relate to people, absolutely have deep empathy, because a person who's gone through it, it's very, 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 for me, for a lot of people, very scary. And I'll absolutely applaud his seeming desire to be open-minded. I applaud that, and I will pray that he keeps at it and he keeps looking, because every single thing he said at the very end about it's very difficult when people start believing in something, they're going to hold on to it and they don't let go. That works for him too, right? It works for you. When you deconstruct, and I'm an atheist, well, now you call yourself and you get a name, you get a label, you get a crowd, you get a pack, you get identity, you get a community. They're all just joining in. I was like you guys, and you just have a new church. That's it. You probably don't sing songs because apparently you don't like worship that much at all. But you might sing songs to Richard Dawkins. You might deepen your heart worship at the feet of a Christopher Hitchens. Eventually be the heroes of the faith, your faith, the heroes, and before you know, you have a community. And then while I'm not saying he's doing this, it's just so common. While we're the open-minded ones, we're now only led by the aid of evidence, and we're not so dogmatic. All the while, they're extremely dogmatic, and they only have an intellectual incest. They read the same author, do the same thing, and then they only dialogue with people to show them they're wrong, and go run back to the hurdle. Did you leave what so-and-so said? What would you say to that? They said, what do I say? You just become an atheistic apologist. And so that's what people do. They tend to do that. And so I hope you don't do that. I hope the guy watching this doesn't do this either. I hope he can. But having said that, there's nothing wrong with saying I find certain things convincing. We don't need to, I don't see any intellectual or moral reason to say that I'm every day waking up off the bed going, what do I believe? What do I believe? Sometimes we just find a reason to go, I find that persuasive. That's all. That's all. On his view, particularly if atheism really is true and there is no God and we're just evolved chimps on a speck of dust, then I'm going to ask all kinds of questions like, who gives a rip if people feel validated? Who cares if we're all evolved chimps? And who cares if they get comforted by your video? And who cares why in the world would you say, I want to be open-minded? What's the value in that? If we're just born and die, no one gives a crap, why not just go make all the money you can and steal and rob and have sex with everything it breathes? And I really mean that. What would be David, you think every atheist just is mean? No, I don't. I'm saying, why not do it? Why not do it? Well, because I don't live that way. Why not? I mean, chimps do it all the time. Lions kill the other lion and rape their lioness, and they kill all the babies off. They do it all the time. If we're just evolved animals, I mean, that's the part that'd be really interesting to figure out where these moral things come up and you start feeling compassion. I mean, why do that? So then, but to me, it takes me back to evidence again of there's something about humans and this moral law that gives me a pause and go, there's something to this. But that's me. Anyway, God bless you. Let me know if you have any videos like this to which you might think make my reflections, if that's worth it. Leave your comments below, and God bless you. And I do hope to see you next time.